Welcome back. In this video, we're going to add a post-processing volume to our scene so that it looks a lot better because the lighting in here is looking a little harsh and we can make this look a lot better with a post-process volume. Now before we get started, I noticed that there are a few cracks in between the stones, and rather than just continuing to add more and more geometry, I'm just going to go ahead and expand our plane that we have beneath the floor that we added a black material to. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all take this plane, and in the search details I'm going to look for nav, and right here where it says can ever affect navigation, we're going to uncheck that. So that way the navigation mesh will ignore this mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and select it in the world outliner and hit F, and that way we'll focus on it. And I'm going to bring my camera out to the side and bring this thing down here. And with this mesh selected, I'm going to scale it up so that it encompasses the entire ground beneath our level. So let's scale this up. And that way we have this black surface underneath so we won't see any light. Now I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this and rotate it by 90 degrees. And we're going to use this on the other side of the wall as well. So I'm going to bring it close to the wall like this. And then I'm going to duplicate it and bring it over to this side. And because it's one-sided, I'm going to go ahead and flip it around by 180 degrees. And now we have a black surface on the other side of that. And finally, I'm going to duplicate it again by rotating it by 90 degrees. And I'm going to bring it over to this side. And I'm going to scale it down this way. And finally, I'll go ahead and copy it and bring another one over to this side and flip this one around by 180 degrees. And now we have black surfaces on the other side of each floor and wall so that we can't see any light on the other side. Now for the post-process volume. Now we're going to add a post-process volume into our level. So over here in our Place Actors tab, search for post-process volume and drag one in. Now, as soon as you do, you should be able to select it here in the World Outliner, and here in the Details panel, we can set some properties. This is how we're going to make our level look a lot better as far as lighting and other post-process effects are concerned. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is make this an infinite extended volume. So if we don't make this infinitely extended, then we'll only see the effects when the camera is in the volume like that. But if we search for infinite extent, then we can check this checkbox, and now it will affect the entire level. So that's the first thing we want to do with our post-process volume. The next thing I want to do is turn off bloom. Bloom is this annoying feature that changes the brightness when you look at something in the world, and it's a very artificial effect. I don't really like it, and unless you really want that effect, you're going to want to turn the bloom off. So let's go to bloom and set the intensity to 0. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go down to the exposure section. And here for exposure, we're going to check metering mode and set this to manual. This is the luminance computation method. And when we set it to manual, this allows us to use the camera settings. Essentially, the camera settings are the same settings that you would have on an actual camera, like a DSLR camera. And so these can affect the way that the camera looks at the world in the game. Now here in the camera settings, we can scroll down to the camera section and we can enable all of these camera settings. Now the shutter speed is the amount of time it takes for the shutter to open and close when it's taking a picture. And so the higher the shutter speed, the more light it's able to capture. We're going to set the shutter speed to a value of 1. This gives us a lower speed, which means a longer shutter opening and more light per picture. Now the ISO value is the sensitivity in a low light setting. I'm going to set this up to a higher value such as 2500, and now our camera will be more sensitive to the light even in the darkness. Next we have our aperture, and the aperture has to do with how much the lens opens, again affecting how much light we can have. And I'm going to set this to 4.5, and I'm also going to set this maximum aperture to 4.5 as well. Okay, let's move on. Now I'm going to go up to the lens section and find chromatic aberration. So here's chromatic aberration. This is an interesting effect. What it does is it splits each color into its RGB values so you can see each color on objects. And if I turn this on, then we can set an intensity here. I'm going to set a value of 1.3, and you can see now that certain objects look they almost look blurry. And the start offset is how far from the center of the screen you want to go before you start to see this value. And I'm going to set this to about 0.7. So it's a subtle effect, but it looks almost blurry around the edges, which gives a pretty cool effect. Let's continue. Now, under Lens, we have a section called Image Effects, and we have something called Vignette. Now, Vignette is an effect that makes the screen dark around the edges. And if you turn this up, you can see the effect of the vignette. And we're going to leave this at a value of roughly 0.55. And under Image Effects, we also have something called Grain. Now, grain does what it sounds. It makes the image look a little grainy. And if we turn on Grain Jitter and Grain Intensity, we can give these some values. Now, if we bump the grain intensity up, you'll see the effect of the grain, and you can see the jitter as well. If we turn the jitter up, you'll see that the jitter gets more intense. So we don't want too high of an effect, but a little bit can make it look pretty cool. So let's give this about 0.15 for the grain intensity and 0.15 for the grain jitter. So it does look a little grainy, which is a pretty cool effect. If you want more, you can go as high as, say, 0.2, maybe even 0.25, but that's going to start looking pretty grainy at that point. Next, let's take a look at our colors. So here under color grading, we have saturation. Now, if I check saturation and I turn it all the way down, you'll see that it's basically black and white. And if you turn it all the way up, then the colors are really intense. In fact, it's a little too much. Now, we can make things pop a little more with a saturation value of about 1.2. And that looks pretty good. Now, if we do that, though, we do want to compensate on the shadows a little bit. So let's go down into the shadows and take the saturation for the shadows, and we can take this all the way down so the shadows have no saturation. Now, if we're going to do that, we do want to go to the contrast and put the contrast down a bit. If we put it down too much, then you get a sort of grayed out effect. But if it's too high, then the contrast can be a bit harsh. Let's put this contrast about 0.95. And we can also make the shadows sort of tinted a little bit by altering the gamma. Now, if you take the gamma, you can tint the shadows by color by dragging this into a particular region in the colors. Now, don't go too overboard with this or it'll look funny, but we can make the shadows tinted a little bit. You can give them a little bit of a red tint, a little bit of an earthy tint, maybe even blue if you want. So to give this a little bit darker, ominous of a feel, I'm going to give it a little bit of blue, so that should be fine right there. Now let's take a look at our highlights. For the highlights, if we take the saturation and bump it up, then this can compensate a little bit for having low saturation for the shadows. And for the highlights min, we can set this at a value of negative 0.1. And that'll make us have some pretty nice highlights. Now let's look at the rendering features section. Under rendering features, we have something called ambient occlusion, and this allows us to have a good edge around the objects that makes them more defined and easier to pick out of a scene. Now I'm going to go ahead and set the ambient occlusion intensity all the way up to 1. And there's also under advanced a quality section, and you can set this up to 100% for really nice ambient occlusion. In fact, you can set this even higher than 100%, so 100% is going to look pretty good. Now, if you scroll all the way down, you can see this screen percentage, and this is allowing you to render with a higher resolution than is presented. So you can make this higher than 100%, and if you do so, it's going to look a lot better. But for video games, just know that if you go above 100%, you could get a bit of a performance hit. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like with 200. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And as you can see, the image looks really defined, looks really good. And you can actually set this as high as 400%. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. So as you can see, it's kind of like maximum settings for graphics on a computer game, I'm going to set this to maybe 200. But if I start seeing a performance hit, then I'm going to lower it. I have a decent graphics card, so keep in mind that if you go above 100, you might see some performance hits. Okay, so that's going to conclude this video, and now we see that our game looks a lot more beautiful. We see a lot better contrast, the colors look better, the shadows look better, the lighting is not so harsh, the ambient occlusion looks really good, and so this is going to make a big difference. You can actually see the difference if you go back to infinite extent and uncheck that. Now you can see how harsh the lighting was before, and things didn't really look all that great. And when you check it back, then you have much better coloring, much better shadows, and all those effects are in place. So that's going to conclude this video. Now our level looks a lot more beautiful. See you in the next video.